and start recording again. Yep, looks like we're recording. Okay, so starting up again, we've got about 40-50 minutes to leave a little bit for question and answers. These are the next areas that I'm going to show you how to edit. So that's the fill and stroke, colour, stroke, gradient, swatches and transparency. I'll just actually take a quick note of these. In fact, I've got them there, so I can just use that as a reference. Okay, so I'm going back into Illustrator. That's where we left it off with some showing the eyedropper tool. I'm just going to get rid of these elements. Again, that's just the group selection tool that I've used. It's dragged and selected and just delete them off the panel. I'm going to put another option, another shape back on the artboard, another triangle. So what I'm using, just showing off the colour and the stroke. We've shown this already, but just to reprise, double click on the colour there, brings up the colour picker, and I can select any colour from the colour wheel there, and then any tone in terms of its saturation from full colour to no colour, and the lightness from light to dark. So I'll just pick an orange there for now. You can also change the stroke colour in the same fashion. So what I've done is I've just clicked it so it is at the fore, and I'll double click on that, and I'll choose a nice kind of bright red for its outline. Went too far there. You won't see that just now, but if I click off, there's a very subtle red line there. In order to make that bigger, I will show you the stroke panel, and that's me just increasing the weight of the stroke or the outline. Going the wrong direction there. You can do it by clicking the up and down arrow, you can do it by changing the figure by clicking on the text, or you can do it from a drop down. There's multiple ways of changing these things. Okay, so that's the colour. You can also invert them, so if you select the object and you click on this wee reverse icon here, it just swaps them. There could be circumstances where you need to use that. So that's the colour aspect. The next one was, so another way to change the colour is, rather than double clicking on the selector within the tools panel, you can also go up to colour in the sidebar. So there's colour there, and that gives you a little bit more control whilst you're on the artboard without having to bring up a dialog box. You can change the RGB value of the object. You can also define it by CMYK or by WebSafe RGB. That's either with the hexadecimal or with the colour sliders here. Okay. Just a note on the colour there. When you're setting up your file, you can set up the file to be either CMYK or RGB or any other of the colour methods. Generally, you guys would be using RGB because you'll be dealing with either web graphics or with motion graphics. So they both use RGB values. If ever you need to do print, it would be CMYK that you would use. Now what I'm doing here is I'm manipulating the colours based on RGB values and CMYK colours, but what I'm not doing is changing the colour profile of the actual file. You'll see up in the file element, the file tab here, this has been defined as an RGB. If you wanted to produce a graphic that was for print, you have to change the colour system. You change the colour system by going into File and then Document Colour Mode. Change it to CMYK. As I say, generally you guys will just be using RGB. What I would say is, when you're exporting it, see if you've got it open as a CMYK file, and you export it, it'll export it as an RGB file anyway, so you don't need to worry too much about it. But what I would always advise to do is, if you're working in web graphics, make sure it is in an RGB value, simply because if you export to an RGB value from a CMYK file, I know I'm using lots of acronyms here, if you've got it in the CMYK print color system and you export to the web RGB value, you're asking for the computer to interpret what the color shift is rather than you yourself. So it's better to be operating within the correct color scheme from the very outset. The main thing you would notice is that in CMYK you can't get as bright greens, you can't get as bright yellows, because it's a lot harder for the CMYK range to replicate these colours, whereas within the online colour system you can get virtually any colour at any brightness. Lots of gobbledygook in there, so I hope that kind of made sense. If it didn't, I'm happy to come back and answer any questions about the colour systems. So that's the colour panel and how it affects both the fill and the stroke. Okay. The next one is gradients, which is actually quite a good one to know. I'm just going to get rid of the stroke on this. A good way, just to another shortcut to get rid of the colour on an object. With the object selected, if you press the / button, it removes the colour very, very quickly. And that can apply, and it applies to whichever one you have selected. So in this case it was a stroke. If I change to the fill and press the /, it gets rid of the fill. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of the stroke. Actually, there's another thing just to note. The you may have missed a wee shortcut that I did there. If I want to swap between editing the stroke and the fill, if you press X, you'll see it swapping between the two. So in this case I want to get rid of, say for example it's on the fill and I want to get rid of the stroke, I have to press X and then the / and that gets rid of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, so the gradient is obviously what a gradient is, a gradient of colour from one to the other. You can apply gradients now to either the stroke or the fill. That wasn't always the case. It used to just be the fills that you can do. You can now define the gradients by the stroke as well. There are 3 different types of gradient. There used to only be 2, but they've added a third one just recently called the freeform gradient. I'll show you both of these, all 3 of these. The default for the gradient, so with an object selected, below the colour selector in the toolbar you have these 3 options: a solid fill, a gradient fill and no fill. Okay, so if I click on no fill, that gets rid of the colour. I'm just pressing Command Z to undo that. If it's already on a solid fill, but if I want to create a gradient, I just simply click on the gradient, and that creates a gradient, as you can see, from white to black across a horizontal. That's the default position. It creates it across the horizontal in the first instance. You can change that. You can also change the colour of a gradient. You can also change the transparency or the opacity of the gradient, and I'll show you how that's done. Just to show another way of changing it, you can change it within the sidebar here. So that's the gradient sidebar, and so say for example it is a solid. You can open up the sidebar panel and you can click on a gradient and it will bring it up. You change the gradient by changing these nodes. So these are called nodes on a gradient, and you can define them in several different ways. You can click and drag, and that moves the position of it, and you'll see that it's what I've moved it to is replicated. Okay, so I can drag that left and right, and that defines where the gradient starts and stops. Okay. You can also move the center point of a gradient by clicking this node at the top. Left and right. You can also define it by percentages. It's percentage position between 2 nodes. So let's just go and put that back at 50%, the halfway point. You can also change the colour of them. So if you hover over one of the colour nodes, gradient sliders, it brings you up with either the swatch selection or a colour picker. The colour picker, the default situation, with the default state for the colour picker is simply a black and white. You can change that by clicking on the menu bar in the top right hand corner, changing that to an RGB, so you've got your RGB sliders there, so add red into it. So there we've got a red at one end of the slider of the colour gradient. Double click on the other one and produce the same result. You can also use the colour picker eyedrop tool. Once you've got that done, you can press Shift and it it picks a colour. In this case it's picked the grey of the background. Okay. So let's go ahead and just double click on that, and I'll put a nice kind of orange behind it, so it's got a nice kind of sunsetty feel. The next thing you can do is you can change the angle of the gradient. Now you can change the angle and the distance of this in kind of two ways. First of all, changing the angle, simply just click on the angle selector, and let's change that to 90 degrees, and then it should change it to being up and down as opposed to horizontal. But you can of course change that to any value between 0 and 360. Change it to 45, it does it at an angle. You can also drag the gradient around, so just simply by picking it up and moving it around, and you'll see it changes. If I take it completely off, it will just give you all of the yellow. If you take it off in the other direction, it will give you all of the red, or you can place it anywhere in between. You can also change the values in the same way as you can change the colour sliders and the position of the gradient. You can also do that on the artboard by dragging the elements. Another thing you can do to change that is the opacity. Again, by selecting the colour, you can then change the opacity of that to be up or down. So let's change it to 30%. So that's 30% opaque. 30% opaque. Is that right? Yeah. There's 30% of the colour. So if I now put an object on the artboard, let's put another triangle behind. So that's the triangle in front of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reposition that behind. There's a number of ways I can do that. So the easiest way I would tend to do it is by pressing Command and the back square bracket, if that makes sense, and that just moves it backwards in the order. And you can see that because this is defined with a degree of transparency, it disappears behind it. So this object is in front, but you can see the yellow object behind it because I've added transparency to that gradient. Okay. So that is a linear gradient. You can also do radial gradients, and that, as you can imagine, does it in a circular fashion. The tool for the gradient annotator, I think annotator is the right term for it, is G. If you press G, then it brings up this tool for defining the gradient. You can edit a radial gradient in a number of different fashions. You'll see it's still kept the same yellow but with 30% opacity, and the red with 100% opacity. But what we can do is now, by dragging the node on the outside, make that circle bigger or smaller. We can also make it flatter by dragging and dropping it. And we can also rotate. And we rotate by, I think, is it the far side? Yeah. By hovering just outside, you can also rotate the gradient. So you can appear that way. And you can also, similarly to the gradient, you can lift it and move it about. Okay. So that is the gradient tool. There's also this new feature, which is very, very new, called the freeform. And this is, let me just start a new object with this one. I'm going to change this to a freeform. And basically what it does is it creates all these different positions within it. And you can move it around, and it creates these lovely textured gradients, and it basically works like a light in the middle of a dark room, is the best way to describe it, and it has an impact on the tones within it. And if you double click on those, you can change it to any colour, and it just creates gradients that kind of go across these complex shapes according to its position. You can also increase the influence of it or the range of it by dragging the size of it. Creates lovely, lovely shapes. And if you want to get rid of it, you just drag it off the shape. But that's nice. I'm using this with a client just now. They absolutely love it because their company is all about diversity, and so we're creating spectrums and full kind of rainbows of colour, and it's a nice metaphor for what they're trying to do as a company, is try and create these sort of spectrum of people that work for them and the like. So that's the gradient. The next one is the swatches. So this is what I was explaining earlier on. So this is the default selection of swatches available to you. But you can load up different swatches. And this is just, it takes you through a range of different colours, and it also provides swatches of patterns as well, but I'm not going to really go into these because they're used so seldomly in what you're doing. But this goes through a full spectrum of the primary colours, but then also goes through a spectrum of purples through the whole range. It's just basically a predefined selection of tools, but where I think it's quite useful for the next stage is, say for example we choose a green and we want it to be a very specific green, and we want that green to be ever consistent. You can double click on it and change it to, rather than being a process colour, change it to being a spot colour. Or rather, in fact, you don't even need to make it a spot colour, you can just make it a global colour. And then that means that it creates it in this kind of fashion here. I'm just going to drag it to the bottom of the pile. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of all the swatches that we're not using by doing select all unused and getting rid of them. So that's just left me with black, white and that green. But I want to create another green. Just go back into there, and I'm just going to pick a different green. And a third green. Okay, so say that's my brand colour scheme that I'm wanting to use. I can then add these as swatches. So if I bring up the swatches again, it's got this colour selected. I can click on this new swatch button, define it as a global colour, and you'll see it adds it to the selection. Same with this one. Select, process colour, global, and then it adds it. That means that once you've got the swatches available like that, what I'm doing just here, just so you know, to create these new shapes is I'm pressing Alt when I select them and dragging away, and that's creating a replicant shape. Say I go halfway through the day and I've got that defined and I decide, do you know what, that's not the right colour of pale green that I'm looking for, I want something just a little bit richer. Instead of having to select all the instances of that green within the artboard, I can double click on that swatch, change it to something that I think is the right kind of colour, maybe just a wee bit richer, wee bit darker. Yeah, I want something a bit more earthy, so that's a good colour there. When I select OK there, it will change all of the instances of that colour to the new colour, which is good when you're controlling that you've got that level of control through the system. As I said, you can actually, once you've got a colour selected, and this is what we're talking about, the colour guide, it gives you these different complementary colours when you select it out.
Excellent.
And there it gives you the different left complement, right complements, monochromatic versions of it.
I like that very much.
So that allows you to build these mechanical kind of, selections of it based on colour theory.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot.
Yeah.
That would make things a lot easier for me.
So that's just loaded that in. Okay.
And design your next bit of quilt work in here.
No, not quilt working, but yeah, that's actually the concept using the embroidery.
Okay. And so it's created all these as defined colours. Okay. So that is swatches. The final thing to show you on this before we move on to doing the demonstration, and are we okay for time? We've got about half an hour after, or 20 minutes after this, is just transparency. Transparency allows you to layer objects on top of each other and still see through them according to different values. So with the transparency sidebar option open, you can change these to either normal, which is full transparency but no full opacity, so you can't see through it, to things like multiply. Multiply works like as if you've got overhead projectors. If you can imagine putting an acetate on top of the other one, it allows you to basically see through it with a little bit of darkness added to it. It allows you to do things like screen, which it has basically different impacts depending on what its values are. I won't go into this in too much detail other than say what I use more often than not is multiply. It allows you to create these kind of more depth to your design by adding multiply sometimes. It's sometimes handy if, like, for example, you have, going back into, if I take a bitmap image onto the artboard, for example, if I wanted to add a little bit of depth to that image, that's me multiplying a shape on top of an object. And that's quite nice because it might create a nice little bit of little darker area that you might want to add, like some text or something. Like,
I think I've seen that in use in advertising, in print
Yeah.
advertising. Yeah. Where you can see it's the same picture underneath.
yeah,
Yeah.
just creates that kind of shape.
It's a cool picture anyway.
That's it's an event that's on this weekend, the Argyle Rally. So yeah, so that's the only one I'll really show. I mean, there's one that might come up in the design that we're doing. Sometimes multiply doesn't really give you, it allows too much of the image below to be seen. A good way of getting around that is using different types of transparency. So that's a multiply. If I then copy that and then paste below it, you'll see it goes a bit darker again. That makes it a little bit darker, which is a little bit clearer. You can see the number one, but it doesn't make it any flatter, if that makes any sense. You can still see a lot of detail. If you want to remove that detail, rather than using a multiply, what I tend to use is a screen and a multiply on top of an image, and it creates a flatness, which is quite nice in design. So I just changed that bottom layer to a screen. You can see it's kind of taken out a lot of the detail. You see that? So if I take out the top layer, what I've done is I've deselected everything, selected the top one, and I'm just going to hide that. The shortcut for hiding an object on the artboard is Command or Control in your case, and 3. That hides it. You can see that that's the effect of the screen transparency. And if I hide that one again, that hides all of it. If I do Control or Command and Alt and 3, it brings them all back. You can see the difference. Yeah. So that's all the things that I intended to show you. So I'd like to go into the Argyle Financial. Just very quickly before I do that, another just wee thing in terms of tidy artwork. You'll see how I've created this object here, and like say for example we were making a postcard and this is all sticking off the edge. You can tidy that up a wee bit without losing the shape of the triangle. If I take a square object, the square vector, and I select a shape around the image like that, I can select that image and select the two triangles by pressing Shift when I'm dragging. So I've got all of those objects selected, and what I'm creating is a wrap. So basically I'm cropping the triangle out of this so it's nice and tidy. The shortcut for this is Command 7, but the way to get to it is Object, Clipping Mask, and make that. So I'm wrapping it in there and it just tidies it up a wee bit. So that's just, that'll be handy in a later thing that we do with After Effects, I should say. Okay. So that's the tools and the sidebar things. So what we're going to do is create this logo. So does someone want to use this computer and someone use the other computer, or?
I don't know. Do you want to show us how to do it first, or?
Well, do you want to bring that up so two people can work on it at the same time?
Which one do you want to do? I'll keep on going.
Okay. Who can I trust with the Mac?
John?
John, do you want to?
Back my leave.
Oh, that's okay. You'll be fine. You'll be fine.
Oh, Graham, go on, Graham.
We need someone to do it because this one is recording the.
I'll do it. I'll do it. But
Right.
Go,
Okay.
Graham, thank you.
Let's put my shoes on first. Unless you want to do it.
Take my leave.
No, okay.
Okay. So let me just show you on screen what we're creating. So that's what we're going to create.
Wow.
Is the Argyle Financial
Look, boys.
logo.
No worries.
Okay. But I'll talk you through it bit by bit. Okay. So go back into this. So Sean, you can follow what we're doing on the overhead projector there if you want. So the first thing to do is we're going to create a polygon, like a vector shape of a triangle. Sorry.
We haven't got our
Oh, no.
job yet even.
Okay.
Hold on.
So, because this is us literally going into for the first time.
All right. So
It's like a let's start something new, or
yeah,
it's just how to get even that art canvas in there.
that's a good point.
So
Right. So see if you rather than that one, if you do Command N, that'll create a new Control
Yeah.
N.
okay.
This will be the first time this has ever been used on this machine, right?
Okay.
So you can maybe, I don't know what's a closer one.
What's that when you start?
Right. So
Presets.
if you go to Web
Uh-huh.
and just do
Oh,
What's it called? Okay, good.
okay.
okay, just create.
Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. You're probably, because it's the first time this has been used, you're probably right. So the first thing we're going to do is create a vector shape of a triangle. Do you remember how to create a vector shape of a triangle?
Is get recorded.
Yep.
Yay.
Right, you got that? And if you press shift whilst you're dragging that, it'll keep it square to the
Oh.
bottom. So if you want to, just delete that one, there, Graham. If you just, that's okay, that's okay. If you just, with it, it's selected already, so if you just press the backspace, you'll delete the object.
Corner there.
Uh-huh.
Oops.
Okay.
Pretty good now.
Right. So
Again, if you just go up to the triangle again. Yep. Polygon tool, right, you've got that there. Right, so drag and press shift, it will keep it square to the bottom.
how can you drag and press shift at the same time?
Shift at the same time. Yep.
Oh man, that's the limit of my my reach. My fingers are
You don't-
stretched.
you got it. Listen, let's not be too precise about this. If it's not absolutely spot on first time, remember, this is the first time you've used Illustrator. I've been using it for about 15 years. Why don't you try and use, Graham, the rotate tool to take it basically square. So press R. If you press R, that'll give you the rotate tool. And then just click on anywhere in the object and then just click and rotate it. Okay? Okay, so basically. So don't worry about it being too precise. Okay? Okay, right, you've both got a triangle on it. Just now, right, so yours is, Graham's is green because that was the previous shape, that was the configuration of the previous shape. Sean's just now doesn't have any, well, it's white and the black outline. So let's get rid of the black outline, first of all. So by doing that, yeah, you've got that straight away. And let's define a colour. So it's not white, so you can see it on the board. So let's pick a green, no, not for the outline,
Oh, sorry.
for the main fill, select a green for this. Okay, perfect. Okay, so you've both got green triangles. Right, what I want to do now is replicate that shape side by side. So what you want to do is Control copy and then Control F. Oh,
Hold on now.
that's okay. Right, so select the object first. Oh, how have you got a circle there? Okay. Right. Control copy, Control F, and then drag it to the left hand side. Or the right hand side. That's it. Yep.
What's control copy? Is that Control C?
So it's Command with yours. We're working between a Mac and a PC here.
No. we're stretching you.
Okay. So is that just one object that's there? Right. So you did that right.
All right.
And so what you're doing is you're just dragging to the left. And if you drag it to the left and you press shift, it'll keep it on the same plane. Okay?
I may have done that a few times, Alistair.
That's fine.
Maybe a few under there.
Okay? So have you both got a green triangle like that on the artboard?
Yeah.
Okay? Right, so what we want to do to create to marry that up is we want to rotate it so that it buttresses up against the other side. We did this in the previous one. So that was the rotate tool. So if you press R for rotate, and then you click it on the bottom left hand corner of the right hand, that creates the little anchor point should move. Yep, that's it. Graham just did
Control
it.
tab. Control tab.
Yep.
Or
That's fine. And so if you then select the top of the triangle, oh sorry, so if you've got that, so if you click on that bottom left hand corner, right, that'll move that over to there. If you just click once there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So if you select the top of it,
See, that was an anchor point.
you can move that around. Okay, so Graham, if you click once there, yeah. Graham,
Yep.
yeah, click there once.
Lovely
That'll move the anchor point.
Yep.
Okay, and now go to the top of the triangle, and then just drag it round and against. Okay, perfect. Okay, so you've both got largely the same position. Don't worry about them being a wee bit out. We can tidy them up afterwards if we have time. We're probably not going to have time. Right, so what we've got is two shapes there. Now they're quite big on the artboard. What I'm going to ask you to do is reduce the scale of both of them. So what you want to do is use the group selection tool or the selection tool. Doesn't matter, each of them. Yep. And drag and select both items. Okay? Both of them are selected? Perfect. What I want you to do is change the scale of them. So the shortcut for the scale button is S. Right? And similar to the rotate button, if you place the anchor on the position that you want to scale it from the anchor off, so that could be anywhere really, and then select a part of the then if you press shift whilst you're moving any other part of it, that will keep constrain the proportions. So you've done it there, Sean. Very well, very well. That's it, perfect. Right, so make it a little bit smaller each, okay? Perfect. Right, so now just so we know we're defining two different shapes, because they're both the same colour, what I want you to do is change the colour of one of the triangles to be in a slightly different shade of green. So just now, both of you have both objects selected. If you click off the object, so you're not selecting any, and then just select one of them and then change the colour of that. You can double click on the colour to get a different range of options available. Okay? Perfect. Okay. Right, so what we're doing to create the A shape is we're just basically replicating this shape up progressively to the right hand side. So if you select both of the objects again, and then do this function where you're copying it but pasting it in front of the objects. So that's Control or Command C and then Control or Command F, and then that should replicate the images on top of each other. And then what you do is just drag them and move them up above and to the right. Perfectly done, Graham. Yep.
No pressure, Sean.
What's happening, Sean? I'm in a mark and everything here. Come on.
Oh my god, I can see what you're doing now, that whole stacking thing for the A.
So,
I see
how
what
does
you're
like
doing
both?
now.
I think we've both got them selected already, so just drag them up.
So Control C, Control F.
Yep. And then just drag them up. Click and drag up. Right, you got one of them there. That's okay. Try it with that one. Try and pull that one into position. Right, okay, so you only copied that one. So if you just do Command Z, that'll take you back a step. Or you can put it back, right? Well, there you go. Right, okay. So now we've got four shapes. Let's just, because the colour brand has four different shades, let's change the colour of both of those. So change one of them to blue and one of them to another shade of green, or two shades of blue. Doesn't really matter. Just so we can tell that there's four different ones.
That's the purple scale now. I like purple. Are you in for purple too? Oh, well, it might not be. It's not as tight as I can write in them.
So what was I doing wrong? Trying to select both there. So
Yeah. So what if you want to select both?
Uh-huh.
What you can do is you can select the direct selection tool, and then just drag over the two.
Ah, okay, that's what I was doing wrong, right.
Okay. Okay,
Mm.
so let's do that again just to take that next tier up. So you're going up to a third level. So if you select the two top ones or the two bottom ones, in fact probably the two bottom ones, so that you're going green, purple, green. So command C and then F, and then drag again to the top. Okay. Okay, perfect. Now instead of taking both this time, just take one of them, and it's the lower of the two top ones. So the bright green in your case, Graham, and this duller one, and take that one to the top. So select it with the direct selection tool. Yeah.
Shit.
You could do the reflect thing, couldn't you, as well?
Yeah, you could do
Yeah.
the reflect. In fact, that's a good point. That might make quite a nice effect. Well, first, rather than placing it there,
Hello?
if you put
Raise
that,
the head, you're
Graham,
doing
if you
it,
put that one
yeah.
to the top,
This one.
put that one to the top to create the peak.
Oh,
Will the canvas automatic,
yeah.
or will the artwork automatic now?
Oh,
Yeah,
no,
okay.
you'd have to move it
That's
back
fine.
onto the artboard.
Right, so you're taking that. If you select that one,
Mhm.
and then do Control C, Control F, and then just take that one to. Oh, you took the bottom one. I thought you'd taken the top one. That's fine. You just leave that one there for now.
But if you reflect
Oh,
those
nice.
bottom
I've
four
done
now,
that.
that should be the
Right,
whole thing.
so
just
take
now, shouldn't
this
Give it a shot.
This one?
it? No, I'm actually
Copy
proud of
C,
it.
Control F, and then move that to the top. Move that above
Onto the top,
onto
okay.
the top. Right. Okay. Now, if we want to do, right, Graham, rather than taking the topmost of that, see if you take the 5 that are at the bottom, so not the kind of middle green yet.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, those ones.
How can I select those without selecting that?
By using the direct selection tool,
Just click on one and then.
you can either add them by pressing Shift and clicking on them, or you can drag over an area that will just encompass all of them.
Got them.
Yeah, you've got all of those
Yep.
selected? Okay, so if you do the Command or Control C, Command and Control F, you can use the Reflect tool as Nicola. So rather than pulling it to the side,
Oh.
just leave them there. Right?
What's that, Sean? It's recording, don't you know?
He's too much in the background. Okay,
So
on the mic.
did you copy them back on top of each other?
Uh,
Did you do that as well?
yeah.
No,
You had
I've
done the
messed up.
command F.
I've done the copying, yes.
Just leave it there just a second whilst we catch up here, right? Perfect. Again, don't worry about it being too precise just now, right? So if you use the direct selection tool, so
Mhm.
that's not a direct selection tool there, so if you press and hold it, and then that's this one. Yeah, that one. You can drag here and then down to there. Yeah,
So I get
without
all these ones?
taking, yeah, that's it. Perfect. So you've got all of those.
Okay.
Right, do that thing where you copy and then you paste it in front of, so Command C, Command F.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's you in the same position. Now your anchor point for this will be here, because when you reflect it,
Sure.
it should fit on that gap. So if you press the O button or select the reflect tool is behind the rotate tool.
Oh, okay.
Did you get that, Graham?
Uh,
Reflect tool is behind the rotate, yep. So use the anchor point to be this point here, Graham. 'Cause
right.
if you can imagine, when you flip it across, that will take it.
Oh.
Right, undo that. Control
Oh.
Command Z to undo.
Come on, Zed.
Right, so just click and hold it
Sean.
in that position.
So, where am I getting this?
We won.
And you got it. Perfect.
Graham was told to hang on.
Oh,
That's it. Just click again in that
They would
position.
have to be doing that reflect.
I need to click and hold.
Click and hold, yeah. Undo
Command.
that. Command undo. So just click once on that point,
Quickly.
and then drag it. Go to that part, any part of the object, and then click and hold it, and then press Shift.
Hey.
Press Shift at the same time. Oh, that's fine. You've done it. You've done it perfectly. There you go. Right, so you've got the basic shape of the brand now.
Wow.
Right, what to do is just, both of you have just, it's amazing how similar your
Breathe.
positions are with this. If you just select all of them, reduce the scale of it, and move it just towards the middle of the artboard.
How do you reduce the scale again?
Yeah.
How How do you do that? Command.
S is the shortcut for scale,
And then up and down it.
and then you can just drag at any point. See when you're
Whoa.
doing this. Sorry, no, actually, what you're doing there is an interesting. What you're doing there is an interesting learning point. It's best. See if you undo that. So Command and Z or Control and Z. See if you work. See if you. Basically, it works sort of in towards it. So if you work from these extreme planes of the lateral and the horizontal and the vertical, any small change that you make to it will have a disproportionate effect. So I always find try and pick a point which is about 45 degrees from the object, and then scale it from this. So pick a point that's maybe down there, and then press Shift whilst you're doing it. Will constrain the proportions.
Right, okay. So I've got things selected.
Actually, probably an easier way to do that. See if you, rather than trying to use the scale tool for this, you can actually do this using the main selection tool. So if you press V or select the main selection tool, you'll get this shape, and it allows you to control the nodes.
Yes.
And if you press Shift whilst you're doing that again, it will constrain the proportions. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so if you place that, maybe make it a wee bit smaller again.
Have you seen how wonky my thing looks? Look at its right hand foot.
Yeah.
It's got a limp.
So try and move that over to this side of the text. So that's just got the basic
Oh,
we call a mark or icon.
Sugar.
Sugar. How do you just move it, Alistair? If you want to.
Yeah, if you drag it and then just click it, well, you've got a group selection, so that's fine. You've got it selected. See if you
Yep.
just
Click the
click
shape.
on any part of it and drag it into position.
Is this position here?
Just somewhere on the left hand side because we're going to add text as well. That's you've got the main part of it. Now what to do actually, so that you're not picking up individual parts, if you select them all and group them. So select all, yep, and then press Command and G or Control and G. Okay, now when you go to select them, so if you click off the shape now, and then click on it now, it will collect everything. Okay? Got that? Okay, so now we're going to add text for Argyle Financial. So if you click on the text button, the text tool, and we'll do this as type tool as opposed to the type tool, which is free text, and just click anywhere. And let's type in Argyle Financial. Okay. Okay, so the sizing on Graham's is relatively okay. It's obviously a lot smaller on Sean's.
Never been used before in this one.
Yeah,
That'll be right.
absolutely.
It'll be whatever the
So
actual box
if you
is.
select it using either of the selection tools, so rather than using the type tool to do it, if you click off that and then use one of the direct selection or the
Alright,
group selection, yeah, it's like that. You'll see it's got those nodes, so you can scale it up using those nodes. Again, pressing Shift constrains the proportions whilst you're doing it. There you go, perfect. If you remember what it looked like in the design, Argyle Financial were on two different lines. So if you double click on the text, that'll bring up your cursor, and if you just navigate to the F and then press enter, that'll take it onto a different line. Okay? We're getting into kind of the more nuance of this. The Argyle Financial brand uses all capital letters. So what you can do to change that, if you select all the text, you can either select the text as Sean has by selecting it and inverting the text, or just as Graham has and selecting the object as a whole. If you go to the menu bar at the top, there's a menu option called Type. About halfway down there's one called Change Case, and you can change that to uppercase.
Wow.
Okay, perfect. The font selection is not your fault, Graham, but it's burning my retinas just now.
Yes.
Can you pick something a little bit more professional?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter which, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Nice, perfect. Right, and if you can just generally position that in place, so it's aligned with the bottom of the object.
Cool.
Perfect. Okay, so that's basically it. I mean, you're not going to win many contracts from blue chip organisations for that brand.
Are you looking for staff, Alistair?
But
I'm available.
that gets you in the position. Now, one thing I'm just going to ask is just, you know, I said about tidy artwork. I like tidy artwork. Okay, so what I want to do is just name some of these layers. Okay, so if we go to if we open up the layers palette, which is the sort of like the square on top of the square, you've managed to hide these remarkably.
Well,
no,
they're
maybe it's not
here,
there.
they're on tabs now, maybe that's the
Oh, that's just a new
version feature.
format.
Oh, maybe it's an essentials as opposed to as their standard one.
Yeah,
No.
okay.
So
So there's your layers there.
Right,
What I want to do is create, and so this is, the reason I'm asking you to do this is because I'm thinking forward to, how are we doing for time? So how do we, oh, that's a span on.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I was getting, right, basically, I'll supply the artwork for this for the next one, but basically what we would be doing at this stage, in order to prepare this for the After Effects tutorial, what I would be doing is I would be changing each of these triangles into a separate layer and naming them so that I know which ones are which. So triangle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and layer text, and I'd also put a background layer in that as well. And what that means is that when we take this file with multiple different layers and import that into After Effects, After Effects will recognise these as individual objects within the artwork and create them as objects that can then be manipulated within After Effects.
Yeah, okay.
That make sense?
That makes sense, yep.
So that's about creating tidy text, which is easy to manipulate when you get onto the next stage. And it's a good discipline to get to when you're at that kind of the situation where you're creating artwork for the first time. Again, that's not something you guys will necessarily be expected to do, but it's good to understand where the discipline
Yep.
comes from.
No, it makes
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's, good
Okay,
work.
well that's lesson number 1 under your belt.
Awesome. Thanks, Alistair.
Okay.
Thank you, Alistair.
I'll stop the recording on that, and obviously I'll make these recordings available through my YouTube channel, so you can go through that and follow the steps again.